Hello wonderful person, this is Anton, and today we're going to be answering one of the bigger mysteries when it comes to the future of the solar system. The mystery here being, are any of the planets going to be around when the sun expands, consumes a lot of different planets and a lot of different matter, and then turns into a white dwarf? With the answer being yes, some of the planets will definitely survive, as we've recently discovered from one of the recent studies that was able to find a white dwarf that seems to have a planet around it. A planet very similar to Jupiter. But in this video I also wanted to go through the overall timeline of what's going to happen in the next few millions and billions of years to help you understand how both Earth and the Sun transform, affecting the life and the possibility of life on planet Earth. And let's start with the general idea of the evolution of stars. So we know that stars that are somewhat similar to our Sun, or more specifically, the stars that are about 50% as massive or about 8 times as massive as our Sun, are all going to transform into what's known as a red giant, the object so large that it's probably going to swallow Mercury, Venus, and possibly even Earth. And eventually the outer shell of this object will dissipate and the internal part of the star turns into a white dwarf. At the same time, all of these stars will also form what's known as the Planetary Nebula. It doesn't really have anything to do with planets, but back in the days when the scientists discovered them, they actually thought that these were planets. Turns out that these are actually just really large gas clouds. But even this is a bit of a mystery. Here the scientists are still not even certain what sort of a planetary nebula our Sun will form either. As a matter of fact, from observing thousands of different planetary nebula around us, there's actually approximately 3,000 planetary nebula in the Milky Way alone. Quite a large variety has been discovered so far, with some of them possessing really unusual shapes, and some of them having features that are somewhat difficult to explain. For example, some of them tend to have these unusual two-sided jets that could be potentially explained if there were two stars in there, or maybe a star and a really massive planet interacting. But statistically, it doesn't really make sense, and the reason it doesn't make sense is because generally approximately 50% of all of the stars out there are single stars, they're not binary stars. And so approximately 50% of all of the planetary nebula should be somewhat spherical or at least somewhat symmetrical, but they're not, and many of them have unusual shapes that we just cannot explain right now. And this is exactly the same reason why we have no idea what the Sun's planetary nebula will look like. But if these shapes are formed by the interaction with large planets, we know that Jupiter and even Saturn have more than enough influence to potentially change and transform the nebula into something a little bit more irregular. So maybe something similar to what you see in this image right here. But obviously this is billions and billions of years in the future. Let's start a little bit closer to now. And so here we can start with some of the changes on the surface of the planet. For example, in approximately 80 million years, the Hawaiian Islands that you see somewhere right there underneath the clouds are eventually going to sink, disappearing completely. Then, within about 20 million years, so basically 100 million years from now, we are probably going to experience at least one more very large impact event, the similar event to what happened 65 million years ago, the one responsible for the demise of dinosaurs. Approximately 180 million years from now, the planet will have slowed down enough that a single day on a planet is now about 25 hours long. And if future astronomers are still around, and if they're actually looking around the solar system, they'll start noticing some changes as well. For example, Martian moon Deimos is no longer in existence, it very likely crashed on the surface. Whereas Saturn lost its rings, it now looks like the slightly smaller Jupiter. But then, 250 million years from now, we'll notice that the surface of the planet transformed as well. We now once again have one large supercontinent. Several different names have been proposed for this continent, with one of them potentially being Nova Pangaea, basically the new version of the ancient Pangaea that used to exist a few 100 million years ago. But for now things are still okay. Things will not be okay in approximately 600 million years from now. Now, first of all, we no longer have any solar eclipses anymore. The moon is really far away from Earth, and it no longer eclipses the sun. But that is not an issue. The issue is the sun itself. The sun, in 600 million years from now, will actually have warmed up just enough to start causing a concern for the planet, way more than any greenhouse gas. It actually starts completely disrupting the carbon cycle on the surface of the planet. And so it's expected that in approximately 600 million years from now, there will be an almost complete extinction of all of the plants on the surface of the planet. which would then completely collapse the carbon cycle. But there might be some other survivors, such as for example algae, that will still be able to provide some oxygen for some of the animal life. And so the animal life will only go extinct in 700 million years from now, with some of the last animals very likely only surviving either at night or in the polar regions of the planet, where the conditions are just a little bit more hospitable. But with plants disappearing, we now have a new crisis. No more oxygen being produced, or not enough oxygen is being produced to recreate the ozone layer. And the disappearance of ozone layer leads to even more extinction events of a lot of different complex life. So in approximately 800 million years from now, we expect there to be a complete end of the photosynthetic life, with Earth possibly becoming some sort of a really large desert world, potentially only having simple single-cellular life. But that life could exist for a pretty long time, although a new problem occurs in about 1,100 million years from now. And the problem here is water starts disappearing. And so the entire planet literally becomes a dry desert world. But then, because of this, we also no longer have plate tectonics, which of course ends all of the geological cycles on the surface of the planet. Now at this point we don't really know how long the single-cell life can survive, but it's basically going to be a very inhospitable world. But at this point, a lot of things will be kind of similar for a pretty long time. In 2.3 billion years, we know that there's a chance the magnetic field might disappear because the planet itself will have cooled down just enough that the inner core of Earth solidifies and prevents the magnetic field from forming. And without the magnetic field, the solar radiation now starts to strip away the atmosphere as well. Now at this point we don't once again know what's going to happen. It might actually go the way Mars went and have nothing on the surface, or it might turn into Venus and have a tremendously thick atmosphere with a kind of a self-protecting layer of the ionosphere that acts as a makeshift magnetosphere. And so in this particular case, nobody really knows what's going to happen. Either way though, in about 2.8 billion years, no more life is expected on the surface. And in about 3 billion years, the moon will have moved away from Earth far enough that it no longer protects the stability of the orbit. And so our planet starts wobbling all over the place, potentially resembling Mars in a lot of different ways. Then, in 4 billion years from now, if there's anyone somewhere in the solar system, they might witness something else. They're going to witness the collision between the Andromeda and the Milky Way. Both galaxies collide, and even though we don't expect any stars to collide, there's a slight chance that maybe the solar system gets actually kicked out and become what's known as the intergalactic object. Or essentially it might no longer be attached to the Milky Way galaxy. And if so, for the next 2 billion years, nothing major is going to happen, it's just going to be traveling across the intergalactic space. But then, 6 billion years from now, that's when the sun starts to transform. It first becomes a subgiant, then starts to grow in size, and eventually starts consuming a lot of the planets like Mercury, Venus, and potentially even Earth. And by this point, there's even been a suggestion that some moons, like for example Titan right here, might potentially become habitable, mostly because the temperatures and the conditions here are going to be very similar to planet Earth. Although some previous studies have also established that because Titan does not have enough mass, it might not actually be able to hold on to the thick atmosphere or any liquid water, and so it might actually end up evaporating and releasing a lot of this material and not become habitable. Once again, another mystery we cannot answer right now. But this will only last for approximately 1 to maybe 2 billion years. In about 7.8 billion years, the sun starts experiencing some really major emissions. It's basically going to be doing this, and that's when it's also creating the nebula that I've previously showed you, the Planetary Nebula. And so even if there's anything left living on any of the moons or planets, it's going to be really difficult to survive these emissions simply because of the energy involved. But at this point, the sun is also going to be losing a lot of mass. At the end, when it's done with its emissions, it's only going to be 54% of its original mass. And so about 7.9 billion years from now, that's when the sun officially stops being a star. It ceases to have fusion and turns into a white dwarf, with the system potentially resembling something like this. But there was always this one major question: are other planets like Jupiter and Saturn still going to be in orbit? Are they going to potentially evaporate? Are they potentially going to disappear for some other reason? Or do some of them stay and remain around the white dwarf for billions of years? Well, it turns out the answer is very likely yes. And the reason for this is some of the observations from this recent study. So first of all, we've already seen a lot of different objects around other white dwarfs. Several asteroids have been found, several planetary leftovers, and even actual chunks of planets with planetary composition have been discovered in the last few years. But finding planets around white dwarfs has always been a little bit more difficult. Very few of them have been discovered in the past, and for the most part neither the planet nor the planet discovered around those star systems have been in any way similar to what we have here in the solar system. But this time the scientists might have gotten a little bit more lucky. They might have identified one star system that seems to have extremely similar parameters to what we expect the future sun to be. In other words, they might have actually found the future image of our star system, with the planet itself being a gas giant that's very likely about 40% more massive than Jupiter, and the white dwarf being approximately 60% the mass of the Sun, very similar to what we expect the Sun to become. As a matter of fact, this similarity with the potential solar system is very uncanny. For example, the distance between the star and the planet is approximately 3 astronomical units, maybe a little bit closer than Jupiter, but we do expect certain orbital parameters to change as the Sun changes as well. But the other interesting thing about the study is the way that they discovered all of this. This was actually based on what's known as the gravitational lensing effect. Or to be more exact, this was a gravitational microlensing formed by a planet and a star passing in front of a very distant bright object. This was originally detected back in 2010, but it was not until now that the scientists were able to use some of the modern telescopes in order to zoom in on the star system and to see the actual star and the actual planet in infrared light. And the reason they think it's the white dwarf here and no other type of a star is because no other type of a light is being emitted by the system. As a matter of fact, this particular object is almost entirely invisible in anything but the infrared. And so it's definitely not a main sequence star because it's not bright enough, it's not a brown dwarf, it's not a black hole, and not a neutron star. And that sort of, by the process of illumination, leaves behind only a white dwarf. But obviously, to confirm all of this, new observations will have to be done using some of the other more powerful telescopes, such as for example the Nancy Grace Roman telescope that's going to become operational in the next few years. Also, this system is pretty far away from us, so even some of the current telescopes are having problem seeing this with any more detail than you see right here. This is about 6,500 light years away from us. Nevertheless, this discovery and the paper is definitely interesting simply because it confirms our original prediction and original assumption about the future of the solar system. It looks like, at least in terms of some of the planets, the white dwarf sun will still have some planets around it, which means that maybe, just maybe, some of the moons of the future solar system might potentially become habitable and maintain some types of life on the surface. But obviously right now, nobody really knows where any of this is going just yet. But for now, that's all I wanted to mention. Thank you for watching, subscribe if you still haven't, share this with someone who loves learning about space and sciences, and check out all of the links in the description below. Maybe support this channel on Patreon by joining the channel membership or by buying the Wonderful Person t-shirt you can find in the description. Stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye bye.